Hey guys, it's Mandy. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I actually started off with a completely different research question, but ended up landing here. In this inquiry project, I asked, what roles and purposes does writing have in other disciplines? So I think answering a question like this can be important because I personally think writing can be a tool for processing and learning information better within any classroom, and that's where my mindset started with this. I thought a great place to start then would be right inside someone's major, within their own field of interest, because I believe that's where students would feel most involved, engaged, and ready to explore. And learning how their words and ideas matter within their own disciplines where their passions lie, hopefully they'd be able to impact their own disciplines with their writing, but they would also be able to help society as a whole. So I immediately began thinking about some of the things we've been learning and some things I had heard about in the past, and I knew I needed to look more into the writing as a process and writing to learn. These things led me to the Writing Across the Curriculum chapter in our Composition Pedagogies book. Because of this, I had a couple of different methods of research. I sent out some surveys and got 4 responses. Those same responders also sent a syllabus from a class they've taught outside of the writing discipline. In the picture to the right, I show how I coded some of the data by placing responses together and highlighting patterns and trends. I'll actually start presenting some of that data now. I'll start with the surveys. The biggest trend I found with these came from asking what roles writing has in their classroom. In some form or another, they all had answers with language deriving from ideas on writing to learn the information in their courses better or to communicate on what they were learning in the class. I pulled quotes from each professor and underlined some of the phrases that followed the patterns. On this slide, I have Dr. Janet Land and Dr. Tom Shields' responses. They are both English professors, yes, and I realize that literature is a part of English studies along with composition. I know they're closely related sometimes. But I asked these professors to do an emphasis in literature because literature and composition are often taught separately, and literature is my concentration, so I was interested in seeing how writing plays a role in it. I'm not going to read all the quotes, but you can see how I underlined key phrases that tie in with the ideas about writing to learn, writing to process and as a process, and writing to communicate. Here are quotes from my other 2 participants, Dr. Robert Bunger, an anthropology professor, and Dr. Lee Johnson, a religious studies professor. Again, I underlined the key language that centered around the writing to learn, communicate, and process that I was seeing heavily in the quotes. Feel free to pause the video and read through the quotes on both sides and look at how they are similar in language. So let's look at how this language lines up with particular pedagogies. So I provided some basics about the Writing Across the Curriculum movement. The second and third bullet point on the left side are the most important. The second is about the movement's intended outcomes, which are helping students become better thinkers and problem solvers, as well as developing their communication skills, and moving away from a lecture mode of teaching to a model of active student engagement with the material and with the genres of the discipline through writing, in all classes across the university. The following bullet point shows how the Writing Across the Curriculum program draws on pedagogical techniques from writing as a process, but with a focus on learning, number 1, the content of the discipline, and 2, the particular discourse features and rhetorics used in writing about that content. Writing in the disciplines is similar but slightly different, with a stronger focus in the specific disciplines themselves. The 2 words are almost interchangeable according to the chapter, and I was wondering why there even has to be a need to, separate these ideas. Why not combine them and have an even stronger effect, as we'd be getting the outcomes from writing across the curriculum, but also learning very specific discourse conventions. I came to see that the difference comes because the 2 have different pedagogical approaches known either as writing to learn or writing to communicate, which are still very complementary in my eyes, but have more obvious differences. As the name suggests, Writing to Learn pedagogy encourages teachers to use writing as a tool for learning. The authors discuss strategies for this, such as the expert's notebook as being something just for the writer, journals as being places to practice without penalty. They give the example of the mathematics notebook, where students can explore possible solutions to problems, discussions of course challenges, questions, outlines, and more. Another strategy is focused free writing, where students can jot down key points, thoughts about those points, and questions. And activities like these give students the opportunity to articulate their perceptions. It really makes me think a lot about our day books. Writing to communicate, on the other hand, has a focus on writing to an audience outside of the self, usually for a formal purpose, for example, to persuade, Writing is therefore crafted, revised, and polished. In both of these, you can see the process pedagogy seeping through, as in Writing to Learn, students are exploring topic ideas, brainstorming in journals, and outlining or working on early rough drafting, while in Writing to Communicate, students can craft and revise. Even though process is still important in Writing to Communicate, it does have more of an emphasis on the product of that process, which is a polished piece that readers are supposed to see. It also uses conventions of the specific discourse community, and the audience is much more specific, usually being members of that community. So think back to the quotes from the beginning that I got from the professors. Can you see how they line up with the language and techniques of these pedagogies? I couldn't help but consider technology, being that we're an online class and that technology is so prominent in our society now. And technology has only made all of these things easier to do, of course. I was exploring a little and found some YouTube videos that show how writing can be used in other disciplines that I didn't get a chance to provide data from. I'd encourage you to stop this presentation and watch at least one of them and do some exploring of your own relating to a field of interest. It's great to me to see how these pedagogies are applied in disciplines that you wouldn't typically think of as using writing. And resources like this are all over the internet, and they're great places for teachers and students both. Beyond that, there are plenty of new media resources that teachers can now implement in their classrooms that follow the pedagogies and outcomes of Writing to Learn, Process, and Communicate, such as online discussion boards, wikis, blogs, and places to chat like we use Google Plus Community, which is actually where I pulled this picture from. If you look at where I put some of the red marks, I wanted to demonstrate how it's a less formal space where we are able to process our thoughts, reflect on what we're learning, discuss what's challenging or even encouraging, and talk about and communicate with our peers about all of this. And I think it's very supplemental to these pedagogies. There are so many affordances to consider in implementing technology into classrooms, but at the same time, using these technologies only opens up another whole set of conventions that have to be taught. Nonetheless, I think technological tools can be very supplemental to these pedagogies, and some of the teachers I interviewed use them because of that very reason. Moving on, I thought it would be interesting to look and see how some of the syllabi I received reinforce the ideas I've been talking about. Since their survey answers lined up so well with the pedagogies, I imagined that their syllabi and ultimately their classroom and assignments would line up pretty well also. I looked at one writing intensive course that is part of the Writing Across the Curriculum program and one outside of the program. So first let's look at the one inside the Writing Across the Curriculum program, and that is Tom Shields' Interpreting Literature class. As you can see in the screenshot on the left, it clearly states in the syllabus itself that it is part of the Writing Across the Curriculum program at ECU and provides ways in which students will be employing writing and developing their writing skills in the class. So right off the bat, we can immediately see how Dr. has approached writing in his literature classroom, following the objectives of the Writing Across the Curriculum program. Then on the right side, I've provided a look at some of the assignments in his class. He has online reading responses where students will discuss their thoughts on the readings that they are doing before class, which brought me to consider that focused free writing and journal type writing under the Writing to Learn category, just instead in an online setting, much like we do. Then he has close readings, which are papers in which students analyze a text based on the details straight from the text. This is a new critical approach to writing, and it is one that is very common in English classrooms. So he is incorporating the pedagogy of writing in the disciplines also, where it has more of a focus on the teaching the discipline conventions and content. It is a more polished, formal piece of writing than the online responses, again, relating back to the Writing to Communicate approach. Lastly, he has a final essay that students must write in class but are allowed to use their notes and books. Here they compare several readings in the class. This is another common writing exercise in English classrooms, comparing works. So, in all of these ways, Dr. Shields is applying all of the pedagogies we've discussed already in my eyes. He includes Writing to Learn through focused reading responses and Writing to Communicate as writing as a discipline through the close readings, which are textual analyses, and the final paper. By the way, the blue highlighted in the picture under close readings shows where he applies some process pedagogy in his classroom also. He has conferences with students to discuss their work, they turn in drafts, do outlines, and even have a revision process. So in my eyes, his syllabus is ultimately reinforcing the ideas that he stated from the very beginning and the ideas and pedagogies that we've been talking about this whole time. Moving on, the next course is the one outside of the Writing Across the Curriculum program. It is Miss Lee Johnson's Intro to the New Testament. Even though it is a completely separate discipline, she employs several writing assignments in her classroom that work similarly as Dr. Shields's. Hers is more obviously aligned directly with writing to communicate within the Writing in the Disciplines approach. And she has two major assignments that coalesce with and are conventional modes of writing in the discipline, religious studies, or more specifically, biblical scholarship itself. These are textual criticisms, much like an exegesis of Scripture, and redaction criticism. And both of these are very important tools in biblical scholarship, and one must learn this as well as how to employ this kind of writing to certain audiences in the discipline itself. This directly lines up with the writing to communicate approach within Writing in the Disciplines. Also, if you look at some of the specific course goals to the left, she talks about how students will learn to engage in critical conversations of current biblical scholarship and will employ exegetical methodologies and more. These are very clearly part of the writing to communicate approach, as students will learn discipline conventions and how to engage in and employ them. However, she also employs some writing to learn, as she also has online discussion forums set up as a place where students can collect terminology, ideas, questions, and more that will end up serving as a study guide in preparation for tests and the final exam. Once again, I think her syllabus reinforces the pedagogies we've been looking at, as we see the writing to learn in the online discussion forum and the writing to communicate within Writing in the Disciplines in the assignments that she has in the class. So I'll start wrapping up now. In this project, I've learned that writing can be used as a means to learn content, process and further understand that content, and then learn how to write and communicate to others as members or even outsiders of a discipline's community. And this goes for every discipline. Beyond that, I think it can be a great resource for creating citizens who compose and care about and are passionate about what they're composing. As a student who double majored and was interested in several different disciplines, I think it's great to have spaces where you're learning about a field, its content, and how to engage and get involved in specific discourse communities. If I continued to study this topic, I would want to do an observation to see how writing is approached in the actual classroom day to day, which is something I'm actually pretty curious about still. I know some purposes of writing in other disciplines and across the curriculum, but now I'm curious about the next step, the application of those pedagogies. Looking at the syllabi was a great first step to seeing those applications, but I think in-class observations would definitely further my understanding of those applications. So I'm going to leave you with a few questions. Number 1. For those of you that are already teachers, how do you employ some of these pedagogies in your classroom? How do you think they're useful for your students, or even for yourself? Number 2, do you think there is such a thing as a non-writing classroom? Number 3, can you see how these pedagogies operate in courses you've taken that you wouldn't typically think of as using writing? What about some of the courses you're in now? I'll give you guys my thoughts on that second question, which was, do you think there is such a thing as a non-writing classroom? When I started this project, my question was, what roles and purposes does writing have in non-writing classrooms? And I changed the language there because it's clear to me now that writing has a place across the university, throughout the disciplines, in every classroom. And in the end, I don't really think there is such a thing as a non-writing classroom, because it seems that every discipline can employ writing in some way or another, and I think that's great. I hope this project has been engaging and interesting for you all. Thanks. Bye.